Hi, everyone. My name is Emmeline Foster, and I'm the Executive Director of the French American Foundation here in the US. Welcome to all of you to a special Zoom webinar on rethinking cybersecurity in post-pandemic world with Steve Durbin as a guest speaker and one of our forum members, Kathryn Harrison, as a moderator. For those of us joining us for the first time, and there are many of you joining us for the first time today, the French American Foundation's webinar is an opportunity to engage our broader community in dialogue surrounding questions of mutual interest for both sides of the Atlantic. Cybersecurity being one of our frequent subjects of concern, we host an annual conference with leaders from Europe and the US every year, and this year it will happen on December 2nd and 3rd. So please do let us know if you're interested in joining. Before we begin today, I have the pleasure of introducing my friend, Kathryn Harrison. Kathryn is the founder and CEO of the DeepTrust Alliance, a nonprofit building the solution and ecosystem to tackle deepfakes and misinformation. Prior to founding the DeepTrust Alliance, Kathryn spent nearly a decade at IBM. She most recently served as Director of Global Product Management for IBM Blockchain Platform. In earlier roles at IBM, Kathryn led the payment and blockchain team for IBM Middle East and Africa, and the Smarter Cities team for IBM's Global Business Service practice. So thank you again, Steve and Kathryn, for agreeing to be speakers today on this topic of rethinking cybersecurity in a post-pandemic world. We're very fortunate to have you, and now I leave it to both of you.
Thank you so much, Emmeline. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and I am thrilled to have as our speaker, Steve Durbin. Steve Durbin is the Managing Director for the Information Security Forum, and he is based in London. He has been a leader in the security, information technology, and cybersecurity spaces for several decades. And he is a frequent speaker and commentator on technology and security issues. Prior to joining the Information Security Forum, he was a senior vice president at Gartner, and he has served as an executive on the boards of public companies in both the United Kingdom and in Asia, bringing unique expertise and experience in technology consultancy services and software application development. He also is a thought leader in the development of security. He has served as an advisor to the Digital 50, which helps to improve the talent pool for Fortune 500 companies around cybersecurity and information governance. And he has been ranked as one of the top 10 individuals shaping the way in which leaders should approach information security careers. So with that, I am thrilled to be joined by Steve Durbin. Steve is going to kick us off with about 15 to 20 minutes of remarks on the topic, cybersecurity in this post-pandemic world. And then we will move to questions and answers. I have a few myself, but I'm really looking forward to seeing the questions that the audience will bring. You can feel free to put those in the chat. Thank you very much. And Steve, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, that's lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Kathryn. And thank you to the Foundation for inviting me to come along and talk today about rethinking cybersecurity. I think when I originally said yes to doing this, it was a little while ago, and I had perhaps rather foolishly imagined that it would indeed be a post-pandemic world by the time we actually got to doing this. But obviously that isn't the case. And so there is, I think, a little bit of a reframe that we're all having to go through, just taking into account the way in which the pandemic continues to develop all around the world. What I thought I would do in the next sort of 15 minutes, though, is really talk about perhaps the role that cyber plays in everything that we do. I will talk about the impact that the pandemic has had on security and on people in general. But I also want to cover some of the other issues associated with cybersecurity that simply will never go away. Things like cybercrime, for instance. And then the sort of second part of what I'm going to talk about is really how we deal with that from a business perspective. And I'll leave you with some thoughts. And then really looking forward to taking the questions that I'm sure you'll have. So normally when I talk about cyber, I like to position it in terms of the way in which we're also very dependent upon cyber, and that's increased. Just to give you some data around that, 90% of the data in the world today has been created in just the last 2 years. This year alone, in 2020, information is doubling every 73 days. So that's just an indication of the way in which we've become increasingly more dependent upon information. And I'm not aware of any business today that can operate without sharing information. And of course, when you share information, you potentially open yourself up to a range of cyber criminals, perhaps nation states, depending on where you are, what you're doing. So for me, when we talk about security, I always view it as being an integral part of everything that a business does. And that's why I think that the pandemic has probably had such a significant effect. At the ISF, right at the beginning of the pandemic, so I'm going back now to what seems like a very long time, but it was probably around about January, February, we started looking at what we felt some of the potential impact would be on security. And we began to look at the way that COVID-19, the pandemic, would really affect some of the interrelated factors in terms of global economy, the way in which supply chains have been extended across all industry sectors, across all countries. And I think it's insightful and indeed instructive. I think that the International Monetary Fund talked about the impact of COVID in the following terms. I think they said something like, for the first time since the Great Depression, both advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies are in recession. We've never seen that, certainly in most of our lifetimes. And that has had a very significant effect, I think, both in terms of the way that cybersecurity leaders have had to respond, but also, much more importantly, the way in which every individual has had to adapt. And if we look at it from that perspective of the individual, what exactly has been going on? Well, we've seen a huge amount of public anxiety on a global level around the pandemic. We've seen businesses having to shift overnight in many geographies, from having people working within an office environment to working in environments that are by no means security friendly. So we've moved people from an office environment into the home. The challenge from the security perspective is nobody has really the first idea what goes on in people's homes, and indeed nor should they. But from a corporate standpoint, from a business perspective, we still have to provide that overarching level of security to protect the information that is fueling our businesses. And adversaries certainly understand that, and they have been taking advantage of those new working conditions. But increasingly, as the pandemic has continued, we've seen a very significant effect on jobs. And so we've got another theme that's beginning to emerge, which is that of job security coming under threat. And we're starting to see, therefore, a rise in what we term the insider threat, where fearful or perhaps disgruntled employees might present a potential threat that we have to deal with. And unfortunately, I think that the coronavirus is probably going to be with us for some while to come. And so if we look at some of the assumptions that we have to make around that and how we deal with that from a security and business perspective, I think the first is that, unfortunately, the release from lockdown is going to be increasingly complex and drawn out. If we look at what's going on across some of the European countries, we've seen France recently, Germany, Czech Republic, Poland, the UK, of course, all going back into some fairly stringent lockdowns. Fears of further outbreaks are also going to delay resumption of normal operations. From a business standpoint, if I just take the UK as an example, businesses had started to move people back into this coordinated, controlled office environment. And now they're having to move them back out again. The effect on business is that very many of them will, for the long term, desert the office environment. So the challenge from the security perspective isn't just how do we get things up and running, how do we maintain that level of security across remote organizations, but how do we plan for the future, where we're going to have a situation where a very small number of our people are probably going to be in safer office environments and a much larger number accessing corporate systems from outside. Government response all around the world, and indeed rescue actions, have incurred and will continue to incur huge national debt. That will influence future taxation, certainly GDP and indeed interest rates, creating a very challenging business environment for the coming years. From the security standpoint, what does that mean? Well, it means that budgets, which are normally under pressure anyway in security, will be increasingly so. So the challenge from the security leader perspective is to really demonstrate relevance to the business in terms of how security has a role to play. That's not something that security people have been exceptionally good at, it must be said, in the past. And so we need to learn very, very quickly how to do that much better. I think the third area that we really need to focus on is that of supply chain. The supply chain disruption has really led to a loss of many suppliers across the world. It's also increased competition, but it's presented an increased challenge too, in terms of the need to bring on board new suppliers. And so we're having to adapt the way in which we attract, onboard, and ensure security across the whole range of the supply chain, very often in ways where we can't rely on the traditional method of doing that, which might have been to go and visit. So we have to do it remotely. We have to get smarter about how we do that in an electronic way. And then finally, legal and regulatory pressure, I think, will generally increase over the coming months and years as regulators begin to exert a much greater degree of scrutiny around what has been going on, the impact that it's had on business, and the way in which they may want to change some of the regulatory frameworks that are out there. So those are all very specific COVID-related, pandemic-related issues. But aside from that, we've also got the rise of interventionist and what I would call protectionist governments. If we look at the United States, we've had something like 4 years, maybe a little longer, of a very protectionist approach from the United States. The election results, whatever that might be, may bring about a shift and a change in that. But I think we are set in for a continued period of, if not friction, then challenge when it comes to the way in which the United States deals with China, the way in which China deals with the European Union, and of course there is always Russia as well. So again, from a market standpoint, we have to consider that within the way in which the world is evolving. And the people, it must be said, who've been probably profiting the most during the last few months have been the cyber criminals. We've still seen huge amounts of malware attacks. Ransomware remains one of the, if not the most common and dominant threats that we're beginning to see evolving. And one of our analysts, Dan Norman, was saying the other day that the ability to buy ransomware kits is becoming very much more prevalent on the dark web. You can get one of them for less than $100. So ransomware is still out there. Cyber criminals have shown probably an improved level of what we call operational security, and are proving to be very highly aware of how to hide their identities and indeed their criminal activities, something that's of concern to Interpol, Europol, and of course the FBI. And we're also seeing an increase in social engineering to facilitate these types of cybercrime. Malware will continue to increase. The capability of the cyber criminal to understand the absolute right moment to drop malware onto an unsuspecting individual, to know when they will click on something they shouldn't, really shouldn't be underestimated. The cyber criminal has demonstrated, I think, over a number of years, their ability to really run as fully functioning operations, and to be able to invest very heavily in understanding the way in which we use our technology. If we go back to the fact that as I was saying at the beginning, that there isn't a business today that isn't dependent upon technology, upon sharing data, that really gives you quite a frightening insight into the opportunity that exists from a cybercrime standpoint. And I think the challenge that we all face in terms of protecting not just our personal data, but also the corporate information that we'll be accessing from what must be said, remote locations going forward. So if we look at the overall landscape from a cyber security standpoint, we've had COVID, we've had the traditional cyber criminals, and we've got some of this government intervention going on. So from a business standpoint, where do we really go from there? What is it that we can actually do about all of this? Well, I do think that organizations are adjusting to this new operating environment. I think that security's role is becoming much more formalized in normal business operations. I quite often talk about the fact that we really know that we will have arrived at true integration when we see the complete disappearance of security functions, because they've been integrated into the business function as opposed to being a separate department. But increasingly, we're going to have to take into account key considerations around the integrity and availability of our assets. And I include people in that as well. We're going to have to really work through the value of our products and our services to existing and new customers so that we can continue to provide that level of service, irrespective of the impact that some of the things I've been talking about will have on us. And that means that we have to build out a cyber resilience framework. We have to really recognize that we need to deal with, or prepare to deal with, the severe impacts from cyber threats that we probably can't predict and we certainly can't prevent. So what we're doing is making sure that we have the ability to get our systems back up and running, but we're doing everything that we can to really partner, collaborate, both with law enforcement and with other organizations within our vertical sectors and indeed globally. But I think perhaps more importantly, we're having to introduce a degree of agility into the organization that allows us to prevent, detect, and indeed respond quickly and effectively, not just to incidents, but to the consequences of the incident. So we've been very good from a security standpoint at focusing on getting systems back up and running. The next stage on from that is to also look at the consequence of an incident and to plan for how the business can react within a similar time frame. So I think that going forward, as we begin to rethink the way in which we operate, we will see very many more what I term business integrated security strategies. So the combination of an information security strategy with a business strategy, complete alignment across those different areas. Because that is the way to address some of the resilience requirements that I've just been mentioning. So if I look forward out to 2021, there are a number of areas that I think we're going to see security planning having to really step up in what I hope will be a post-pandemic environment, focusing on how to mitigate risk. And the first area is going to certainly be around risk management. I mean, security for me today and in the future is all about the management of risk. So we need to have some sound frameworks in place so that we can identify changes to regulations, to policies, and really react to those in a very agile manner. The second thing we're going to have to focus very much on is resilience. This for me is probably the number one business priority. We need to be identifying and reprioritizing our critical assets that have changed in value, because an asset will change in value depending on the stage of development that we're at across the corporation, depending on what we're doing from an organizational standpoint. And we need to be able to protect those assets at all stages of the life cycle. I mentioned supply chain earlier. For me, that is a challenge that's not going to go away. I think supply chain risks are becoming pretty much all pervasive. We need to be not just adopting a new way of working with our suppliers, but of communicating regularly with them, reviewing potential exposure that they have to some of the new threats that might be emerging, and sharing and implementing alternative operating procedures that perhaps we've developed ourselves or in conjunction with those third parties. So we're moving away from just a very straightforward contractual relationship to one that is much more intertwined, much more self-reliant, much more collaborative, and really relies on communication. And I think the other piece of concern for me going forward is that of the workforce, people, because the world of work has changed. It's changed very, very significantly. We need to be making sure from the security standpoint that our policies and procedures reflect that. We need to be paying special attention to cyber fatigue. Too many of our people are spending too much of the day in front of a screen. The day has become endless. If you're not using a laptop screen, you're probably using a phone screen or something else, a tablet. And we need to rethink the way in which we help our people to carve up the day, because otherwise some of the mental health issues that we're going to have to deal with will be the like of which we've not seen before. And the challenge with people working remotely is that we won't spot that until it's too late. So that will lead us into some of the monitoring, the support, and really, I think, trying to provide alternative ways of not just communication, but collaboration over extended days and hours. So I've talked a bit about some of the ways in which cyber has become all pervasive. I've talked about some of the real impacts of COVID and some of the other things that won't be going away, like cybercrime. And I've touched on some of the ways in which businesses, I think, are going to have to react and change. But there are probably just two things that I'd leave you all with before we take questions. And the first is that one of the things that has become clear is that cybersecurity is not something that is done by one single department or one single set of individuals. It is everybody's job. And we all need to be considering the issues associated with storing and processing in an organizational world, mission critical information, in a personal world, our own mission critical information, perhaps our bank details, our personal information, in the context of some of the evolving threat landscape that I've just briefly touched on. The other thing that we need to be doing is preparing for the future. And in that regard, it's about thinking about resilience, our ability to recover, our ability to respond, rather than security, which is traditionally about trying to build a barrier to prevent attacks taking place. And we need to be regularly reviewing and refreshing the way in which we use our technology. From an organizational perspective, that means benchmarking our policies and our processes to remain current. From the individual standpoint, it's about just taking a step back and wondering whether we're actually really following through on some of the better ways of preserving our personal data and security. Our passwords, for instance, are we using biometrics? Are we sharing passwords? Are we using the same password from multiple applications? All of those sorts of things. And for me, increasingly, the world of home and the world of work is blending and merging. And that is something that is giving rise to certainly no end of opportunity, but also is highlighting risks. And from a business standpoint, we need to be taking that into account as well, particularly when it comes to the way in which we're asking our people to work in remote ways. So for me, cybersecurity is an evolving, an emerging, a fast-changing environment. It's one that we continue to need to keep an eye on. It's one that I think is fascinating for simply the speed and the agility that we're having to display to really come to terms with it. And it's one that will continue to have challenges, whether they be from coronavirus or cyber criminals. But undoubtedly, we're going to have to keep rethinking our approach to cybersecurity in the post-pandemic world. Thank you very much. Kathryn, I'll hand back to you for any questions that and conversation that people might now wish to have.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was wide-ranging, and there are quite a number of different directions that we could go. I actually want to invite Jordan Kelly, who's asked a question in the chat, to unmute himself and to ask his question, because it really opens up kind of an existential question about where the information security is headed. So Jordan, can you unmute yourself? Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
I can indeed. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Jordan. How you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. So yeah, it was a question around, we talk about emerging technologies and cybersecurity and the need to leverage and combat the new threats that appear. So do you have an opinion on whether the industry is continuing to evolve and adapt, or do we recognize our part in the greater security landscape, or are we very much sort of falling behind other disciplines? We're sort of failing to realize some of the more advanced theories around adversarial threats, insiders, and psyops, and those sort of techniques that are being used.
Yeah, I think it's a big question. I think that certainly what's going on there is that there is a challenge. Okay, there is so much of this stuff going on, and I think one of the things that we have to do is be really focused around not biting off more than we can chew. So step one, we need to protect, first of all, our critical information assets. That may involve technology, that may involve people. I'm not a huge fan of solely looking at technology to solve some of the security issues, as you know. But I do think that increasingly there is a role for things like artificial intelligence to work in conjunction with human security practices, where technology can really, make use of the things that it's good at. So network monitoring, for instance, would be something that AI is particularly good at. It's a rather boring task. People are not very good at that. So let's have the machines do what the machines are good at, and the people do what the people are good at. I think the other thing, though, and I think this is partly behind what you're saying too, is that we need to have a very open and forward-looking perspective in terms of how we try to anticipate some of the threats that are going to be impacting in the future. And as you know, because you work on the Threat Horizon program, trying to anticipate some of the things that will be changing within a sort of 2-year horizon is hugely challenging. But when you get it right, it reaps a tremendous amount of benefit. So I think it's a combination of all of the things I've just been talking about, that sort of forward-looking piece. It's the reliance on technology for doing what technology is good at, and not forgetting the role of the individual.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. I want to jump in with a question. We've talked about where the security world needs to go post-pandemic. What types of companies, who is moving quickly in the right direction, and who is getting left behind, and what do we need to do to bridge those gaps? Yeah.
I think that traditionally we've always sort of pointed at the finance industry as being at the sort of the front end of things, because obviously that's where the money sits, and so therefore that's where the cyber criminals have been particularly interested. I think that we started to see that moving back, including the retailers, because retailers becoming very much more bank-like. But I do think that one of the effects of the pandemic has been to really hit that particular sector very, very hard. And so budgets are certainly coming under pressure in retail, hospitality. We're starting to see failures in that space. And when you have that kind of thing going on, it becomes a very, very tough call for any board of directors to determine how they're then going to cut up a budget. So I think that finance will remain out in front. I think that for some of the other industries that I've just mentioned, retail, hospitality, aerospace, things like that, there's probably a need to be much more collaborative to really look at how you can share some of the best ideas that are out there. Not going down a sort of a crowdsourcing route, but back to the whole sort of supply chain. If we can get people to collaborate better across that, then there are savings to be made, and certainly real benefits to be derived from some of the thinking around how we can deal better with emerging threats. But I think that over the next certainly 12, 18 months is going to be hugely challenging for all sectors. And I think that what is important is that anybody who's working in security, listening to this, really understands the need to demonstrate business value in what security is doing. So alignment between security and the direction that a company is trying to go in, whatever that might be.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to open up to an audience question. John Wall, you actually had 2 questions. So I will, if you would go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask those questions. And then I'll follow up with Jean-Paul.
Hi, Steve. John Wall here with CyberFit. I was, as I've been doing consulting, haven't seen where companies have changed their risk assessment related to work from home, such that they really haven't invested in any additional technology to monitor and secure that avenue than the typical home router. What are you seeing? You have a much broader perspective of what folks are doing than I am, so I was hoping you could lend some perspective on that.
Yeah, good question, John. And I think that what I've seen is that in the early phases, some people were hoping that the home environment wasn't going to stay, so we'd be moving people back. So we're just putting like a plaster over the problem. So let's not get too into having to worry about these things. I think that certainly, though, what has happened is that people have begun to see benefit to the bottom line in potentially not having people having to work in centralized locations. That introduces much more freedom for the individual. And so we're starting to see now people, I think corporations understanding that the hybrid working environment is here to stay. So we're beginning now to see risk assessments starting to change. We're starting to see policies, procedures reflecting that from a security standpoint. Some people, of course, are always still going to be required to work in an office environment. So if you think about some very specialist areas, but for a lot of organizations, as I say, it's simply that they've been playing catch up. And I think in the early days, if you remember, and you may well have been involved in doing some of this if you're doing consultancy work, the major focus was on making sure that people who were working from home could access the systems. That was step one. Then we moved on to making sure that they could do it securely. Now we're entering into, I think, a third phase, which is, let's consolidate that position, and let's now look at the way in which we need to change some of our operating practices, some of our risk assessments to accommodate that, because it's not going to be a short-term issue. And indeed, there is, for very many organizations, business benefit to be derived from really formalizing that more remote approach. So for me, it's a maturing that's reflecting the reality that a lot of people won't be going back to a central office location.
Great, thank you. Open it to Jean-Paul to ask his question.
Well, good afternoon. For me in Paris, I'm General Palmeros. I'm a retired General French Air Force and former NATO commander, and I am the chairman of the cyber group, the French-American cyber group, which is organizing its annual seminar. This year it will be a virtual one, but beginning December, as Emmeline said. So we are really delighted to have speakers like you able to give a high perspective. My question, and it is a permanent question during our works, common works between the French and the US and within the French-American Foundation, is how much we can improve the public-private partnership and engaging each other's, opening doors, sharing information, even if it is tough. And so I will be delighted to hear you about that during the crisis and for the future.
Yeah, I think that combination of public-private partnership is really fundamental. If for no other reason, that there is so much work to do, and so by combining some of the capability that exists within the public sector with some of the innovation that exists in the private sector, I think that brings together and comes potentially anyway, to provide some solutions to some real challenges. I think that one of the things that I have noticed, if I look at the United States for a moment, is that if we went back, I don't know, maybe 3 to 4 years, that the way in which, let's say, the FBI was able to cooperate with private sector and vice versa was really nothing like what's available today. There are very significant outreach programs, for instance, in the United States, the FBI has to provide support to private enterprise. And there's much more collaboration that goes on. If I look at across in Europe, if I look at the work that EC3 is doing in The Hague, for instance, Europol, and indeed above that, Interpol as well, the sharing of information is really at a much higher level. But I think there's a fundamental issue when we talk about certainly law enforcement, and that is that we still have to get away from. There is a big difference for me. So in the private sector, what I'm interested in doing is preventing a crime happening, so it doesn't adversely impact me. Law enforcement, of course, is measured on its success in putting the bad guys away. And if you say it like that, you could take a view that there's not that great a difference. But actually there is, because we're then targeted in very different ways. And so I think the really big challenge is, how do we bring those things better together? And as I say, the FBI has gone a long way towards doing that. EC3 has moved very significantly in that direction as well. But we have to find a way to work better together, to share more information in an open way, to take the best of both of those public and private areas, to deal with what is an increasing and will continue to be a growing challenge from cyber criminals who are very well funded. In some instances, as you know, are nation state backed. And the only way to combat that is through increased intelligence sharing, increased collaboration. And certainly that's what I hope will happen going forward. And I think there are good signs that we're making improvements in that space.
Thank you.
I do want to ask one follow-up on that. We have not talked much in this conversation thus far about the role of social media, disinformation, and information that is spread to kind of the broad public, amplified algorithmically through their algorithms, which can create uncertainty, etc. How do you see that playing into the broader security landscape? How do companies, public sector, concerned citizens need to think about that?
Yeah, social media, fake news is obviously of concern. Why? Well, I think if you look at the way that it's evolved, if you look at our use of social media, we all know that we rely very heavily on people that we know for recommendations, for instance. One of the phenomenon around social media is that we form quite what we believe to be quite close relationships with people that we've never met, that we're never ever going to meet, that we know by their Twitter handle. But we quite like the stuff that they've been putting out there, so we follow them. And we take their recommendations as being something that we should probably follow much more readily than perhaps we used to do. And so the challenge, I think, for the user from a social media standpoint is, how do you differentiate between reality and this false, fake environment that we're in? How do you put in place some of the safeguards? And the only way that you can do it is really by testing out the opinions, the views that are there with people that you do actually know, perhaps, or that you have actually met. But is that going to be good enough? Because increasingly, as we go forward, we're inundated with social media, with information. And so I think it's become very difficult to differentiate between real and the unreal. And as we keep fueling algorithms and providing very much more information, we're starting to see us being provided with things that actually we really quite like. And so again, there is this danger of moving into a very artificial world. And, you know, I could get very philosophical about it. And in one of our recent podcasts that with the business philosopher Anders Inset, we got into some of this discussion. It's available on the ISF website, our public website, if you want to go and listen to it. Because there's a very interesting discussion to be had around the role that social media plays in our lives, our reliance on technology, the trust that we impart in technology. And where we go with that is, I think, really one of the big questions of the next few years, because it will continue to increase and develop, and undoubtedly it presents all sorts of opportunities. But how can we put that genie back in the bottle? I don't have an easy answer to it.
Yes, and I certainly know from our work around deep fakes that AI-generated images start to become problems, not just in fake news, but social engineering and synthetic identities, which creates problems for, you know, far beyond the media, banks, individuals, etc. So
yeah.
Great. Well, we have a couple of comments from a James Bond operative 960643. If you would unmute yourself and share your comments and questions, that would be great.
Also, he wants to stay secret.
Did you say 960643?
I did indeed.
Okay, that's me, Mayor Siegel in New York. How are you?
Hi there.
Let's see. Steve, you have a lot of good comments. I've been listening to lots of these webinars, and you're much more on point than some of these others.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Question I'm seeing since COVID started here in the States in February, I noticed that I talk to lots of small to medium-sized businesses, some of which have a global footprint. And many of their workers are working from home, which changes the threat landscape from an office environment to a much wider network. I posted a comment. Any comments from you about how those companies should be reevaluating their security?
Yeah, good question. For me, it's all about starting with the asset, the information. So figuring out where does the critical information sit? Who's accessing it? How are they accessing it? And why are they accessing it? Do they need to be accessing it? Sounds obvious, but a lot of businesses have just fallen into this cadence of sharing information, and you know, we've seen very many breaches, for instance, that have occurred because people, contractors, had been given access and then it hadn't been taken away. So, first step is just do that audit, figure out what's going on, who you're sharing information with, and how. Second thing is be really specific about the people that you need to be sharing that information with. If I use myself as an example, I don't have access to some of our corporate systems. I run the organization, but I don't need access. And in the days when we used to be able to travel, there was a very good reason for that. It's because I was accessing my information on the road from, in certain instances, not highly secure environments, even with VPN. So I took a deliberate decision to actually cut myself off from some of our more sensitive corporate information, and could only access it when I was in an office. So I think it's about that sort of, you know, complete eyes open approach to who needs to access what, why, where, and when. And then it's about education. It's about sharing. It's about making sure that people who are working in a home environment understand why it might be important to do what you're asking them to do. I get very frustrated. And if you've listened to a number of my podcasts recently, you've heard that come through. I get very frustrated about when we start talking about things like security awareness, where security professionals believe that they have a right to tell people what to do without explaining. That is not a good way to get anybody on your side, let alone in a security environment. And so we have to move towards explaining to people, let them know why, what's in it for them, what's the benefit. And I think if we can switch to that, you have a much richer conversation. People are much more ready to actually do what you'd like them to do, but also they'll come up with great ideas as to how you can improve security. Whereas if all you're going to do is try to enforce a set of policies remotely when people are working from home, good luck.
True. That's very true. Somebody posted a question that I thought was relevant is because, and I think that for all of us listening to this, I think it's relevant, is because many people are working from home, something that the home gateway does not have is much security. And most people are just connected to their home router with a cable, a drop cable, and there is no security. You're lucky if they have antivirus on their machine. Mm-hmm. So I would think that the only way to help those people to protect themselves is A, computer-based security awareness training, and B is when they're connected to an important place, pay for VPN. Because it's the only other way you're going to give them security. And obviously they're going to need some kind of antivirus that's more than signature based that the operating systems are providing.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think I'd go one stage further. And I think that you also need to provide them with support so that they understand, for instance, that they would need potentially to clear down their machine. Say they've got one machine and the kids are using it. And they're using it in the day, the kids are using it for homework, and then they're playing games on it, that kind of thing. You know, there's that sort of basic computer hygiene, isn't there? You know, how to clear the thing down just to keep it safe. So there's some of those things as well that, again, are really into trying to understand the home environment, right? The home environment is one where everything is happening, probably at the same time, particularly if you've got kids. And I think we very often forget that. And that's one of the really big challenges, I think, for home working. That aside from the fact that people are locked into their screens for far too long in the course of a day, and that causes cyber fatigue, as I mentioned before.
Is there any way to add in any more security to a user account beyond the basics? Because if you have multiple people using a machine, then one of the ways that you can protect the machine is by creating user accounts with a super admin and just restricting access per account.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think that the challenge for the SME, of course, the very small organization, is having the skills, the capability to even know to ask for that. And that's where they need the help and the support. If you're a large organization, not too much of a problem. You're going to have some of your network admins, network operators who can do that kind of thing for you. But so it's a real challenge for the small guys.
I want to help us. We've been talking obviously very tactically about some of the challenges as we all sit in our homes and join this conversation. What at a more macro level would help to engender this move towards risk management, resilience, and really ecosystems approach to security? Are there policies that need to be written? Are there regulations? Where are you seeing movement? Certainly be interested in Europe versus the United States. And what do you think it will really take in order to get us in a much more strategic way in that direction?
Yeah, for me, it's we're talking about generations to actually get to that nirvana if we ever get there. Because we have to go back into our schools. I'm talking about kindergarten, I'm talking about primary, I'm talking about then secondary and then tertiary education and then into the workplace. Because if you look at what's happening today, you know, you will have babies that are being given iPads, tablets to keep them amused. They'll continue then with that right the way through. So security has to happen right from the very beginning. But as I say, that's generational. So in the meantime, we certainly need to be, I think, stepping up the way in which we communicate the importance of security. And regulation is one of the ways of doing that. Now, the challenge with regulation is that it's always going to be playing catch up, because regulators don't move particularly quickly for good reason. In Europe, I think the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, moved the whole privacy discussion significantly forward. What we saw was that very many other countries around the world, if not adopting the same standard, produced something that was very, very similar to it. In the United States, there is still this patchwork quilt of privacy regulation, which is really not helping. It's not helping business. It's not helping individuals. You've got California that is pretty much leading the way, but you've also got states like New York and Washington, for instance, that also have fairly good privacy rules. But for me, it's a very personal view, a federal regulation would solve a number of different problems. It would make life a lot easier for business. If you consider a business transaction right the way across the United States dealing with personal information, they need to understand the regulations in each and every state that they're active in. That's a huge burden from a regulatory standpoint for a small organization and even for a large one. So that's just one example of how things could be moved very much more quickly, I think, to help a business from a regulatory standpoint. I think the other thing about regulators is, and it's interesting, you know, the Jean-Paul's question, I focused in on law enforcement, but I think I could equally have gone down a regulatory route. I think there is a need for regulators to work much more collaboratively with the private sector, to understand some of the implications of what they're talking about, and to really upskill, so that they're producing regulation that is as in line as it might be with the role that they have to play of providing guidance, monitoring, and not constraining business. And so I think there's scope in that for a much more collaborative approach than we've seen. And it depends where you are in the world, of course, because certain regulators will have no interest in what I've just suggested, because that isn't the way that they work.
Now, as a follow-on to that, what do you see as the potential regulatory role, as given what's happened with the global pandemic, the recession, et cetera? You're going to have a lot of suppliers that are going to go bust. There's going to be data in all of these different places. This is a question. What is it going to take to be able to secure those assets? Will public sector need to step in? How do you think that industries will need to act in order to prevent significant opportunities for breach?
I think that I'm not hugely optimistic in that space, Kathryn. I think that regulators will sit that one out until such a time as they have to intervene, because I don't think they would know what to do at the moment. So I think that the burden falls on the organization, whether that be a private organization or a public organization, doesn't really matter. And there is an argument that says that that's where it should be. You know, you should have a responsibility for protecting your own data. If you come back into take a European perspective, that is really some of the basic tenets of GDPR and the way in which data management is viewed within a European context. So, you know, the responsibility, the role of the controller for looking after the data, irrespective of where it is, where it's being shared, how it's being used. And I think regulators have shown they're pretty good at monitoring that and responding to it. You know, we've seen things like their response to the Marriott breach, for instance. We've seen response to, say, like the British Airways breach. So I think they get that bit. But I think that because they're somewhat slow to the party, we are going to have to necessarily wait for some of these things to come about and become a bigger issue before they feel able to intervene and do something. I don't see them as leading the way. And I think for very many, it's a very hot potato they'd rather not try to hold.
Get involved with, yeah. Well, we have just a few minutes left. So I want to turn us to some of those emerging technologies, which you have alluded to, but what are the emerging threats, the emerging technologies that you think are not yet being paid enough attention to, that you think we're going to see growing in terms of risk for individuals, organizations, societies? Kind of what does your crystal ball show us as we look ahead 18 to 24 months?
Yeah. I think that, we touched on deep fakes and that kind of thing. I think that's certainly one of the things we're going to have to watch out for. There's no doubt about that. Jordan, who asked the opening question there, he's done a lot of work in that space for us. I think that we need to also pay very close attention to the way in which we are embracing cloud and edge technology. So edge computing in the cloud. I think that if I just go forward, I don't know, 6 to 9 months, I think that some of those issues are going to come and start to bite us back if we're not very careful. I think that overall digital transformation, we talk a lot about that. That means a whole pile of different things to different organizations. But digital transformation, you need to be really careful upon what you're building that on, because a lot of systems, they're written using old computing languages. People don't even exist anymore that can understand them. And yet we're piling other things on top of that. So I think that's a very real issue. I think as well that what we call at the ISF, the Internet of Forgotten Things. So we've seen the Internet of Things coming out. We've seen some recent legislation coming out of California to try to, control that production of things. But that misses the fact that there are billions of these devices that are out there, and they're active, and they're still doing things. And so that's why we come up with the term the Internet of Forgotten Things. And organizations won't necessarily know where they sit in their infrastructure. They won't necessarily know what they're doing because they were just dropped out there. And so what we recommend for a number of organizations that are able to do it is to do an audit again of just the different devices. We had a particular member that had an incident they were in the manufacturing space, had a plant shut down, and suddenly as they were cleaning the machinery, the plant came back to life because one of these Internet of Forgotten Things suddenly decided it was time to wake up. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a fascinating note to end on. If there's aren't any more questions, I want to thank Steve for an incredibly insightful conversation and discussion. I know I definitely learned quite a lot in looking at some of the challenges for security in the post-pandemic world through new lenses. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you to all of you for your active participation and engagement. The questions were really fantastic. Certainly showed that you were engaged and really interested in the material. So thank you for all of that. And finally, I just want to remind everyone what Emmeline had said at the start and what General Palmaros had highlighted as well. The French American Foundation will be hosting its annual cybersecurity conference in the coming weeks, and that will be an incredible opportunity to connect with private sector, public sector, military, a whole variety of different perspectives that are solving these types of challenges, both from a very micro-specific level all the way through to nation-state security and disinformation. So I strongly encourage everyone to join. I was there last year, and I can say firsthand that it was a fantastic event. Also, I encourage everyone to go to the French American Foundation's website, where you can see all of their upcoming events and programming. I'm an active member of the Transatlantic Forum, which has a wonderful set of discussions each month, and there are many, many things that are happening across the forum. So thank you to Emmeline and her team. You guys have put on yet another fantastic event, and thank you all for making time to be here. Look forward to the next event. Take care. Thank you.
Kathryn, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.